So I started off the show by spilling my monster drink all over the desk here. Welcome into Dempsey and Company. Christopher Dempsey, Alex Ryan Nemi, Steve Nelson, Josh Grismer, and you. Altitude Sports Radio 92.5. And we have a special show planned for you today. You'll recall a few weeks ago that we did a basketball roundtable prior to the Nuggets playoff run, which obviously they're still on. Right now going to play on Friday in Phoenix Game 3 in that series. We will now do the same with the Avalanche. And we're going to do so with a pair of reporters who are just at the top. They're just top shelf reporters. And we're talking about, Jesse Montano of DNVR and Peter Baugh of The Athletic. Peter will join us here shortly. He is on his way.
Yeah, Pete took a wrong turn.
Just look for the building with the huge copper windows out there. Jesse, what's going on?
Not too much. Top tier might be a little bit too nice, a little bit generous there, but no. It's a beautiful day outside. You got a great view up here. I found the building just fine. I don't know what Peter's doing out there, but no, I'm doing great. Appreciate so much you guys having me on.
All right, well, let's just dive into all the things. And look, the Avs season didn't end the way I think fans wanted it to, but I think the also fans understood what the situation was with this hockey club in terms of some of the injuries. They finished 51-24-7, 109 points to win the Central Division. They lost to Seattle in the first round, obviously 4-3 Seattle, and incidentally just continues to win games on the road. They are just a juggernaut right now. 4 goals in the first period yesterday, and they held on to beat Dallas in game 1 of that series, 5-4 in overtime. Anyhow, the Avs started the season off 20-17-3. They finished it 31-7-4. Which of those two teams were most indicative of what the Avs were?
For me, it was really the back half. What you saw there, that was, I think, what this group is capable of, and I think it has more to do with the culture that we heard so much talked about in the Stanley Cup year. Now, I don't know if that's 2 years ago now. Do you now refer to that as 2 years ago?
I still think it's last year until there's a new Cup champion crowned. It is last year.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. They're still technically the defending champs for like 3 more weeks, right?
It's as lame duck as it gets.
Yeah. But we heard so much about that culture and just not the next man up. I hate necessarily using that, but I think we kind of forget that the Stanley Cup team had a lot of injuries too, but the group just kind of kept chugging along. And I think that was a little bit more representative of what you saw in the back half there, a team that wasn't really bothered by the injuries, the crummy schedule with back-to-backs like every week there for 5-6 weeks in a row. They just didn't seem bothered by it. They just kind of kept chugging along. And I think that was what you were hoping you were going to continue to get as the playoffs came around.
Yeah, and last year, right, all those injuries happened, but there was always an end date on an injury. There was always, all right, we just got to get through a couple of games, and we know we're going to get Arturi Lehkonen back.
Yep.
We just got to get through 2 weeks, and we know we're going to get Nazem Kadri back from a broken thumb. This year, you had this, nearly every injury you saw was like indefinite, right? No timetable is that's the cursed term this year, is no timetable.
Yeah, well, and then not to get too far down the injury road, I'm sure we'll get here in a little bit larger scale, but the part to me that was crazy was, to your point, it was either no timetable or when they said 6 to 8 weeks, it was 9. Like they didn't get anybody back on the short end of their injuries. You look at a team like Boston, who obviously had their own kind of, collapse last week, but they had a couple big injuries at the start of the year, and they got each of those guys back over a month ahead of schedule. The Avs did not have that, maybe with the exception of Eric Johnson there right at the very, very, very end. Every injury was either no timetable or it was to the max extent of what they were expecting.
You know what? Also, look, when the playoffs started, they had almost everybody available, but I just wondered going into that actual series, but how healthy actually were they? I mean, that seemed to be availability versus actual health seemed to be like an issue for me.
I'll put it this way. The conversations that I had with some of those guys that, you're talking about saying not quite at 100%, it was a lot of, I'm as good as I'm going to be. I'm as close as I can be. I'm trying. And there wasn't anybody that felt like, yes, I'm good to go. We held me out a couple extra games to get to this point. I'm 100%. I'm good. Everybody was, that's as close as it's going to get.
You saw You saw that out of Josh Manson as well, where he comes back clearly, like, what, 70%? That might be generous. He just simply wasn't the same player he was last year. And it's not because Josh Manson fell off a cliff. It's because, well, they rushed him back from injury because they needed to. I fear that as the weeks come along and you see more and more guys go under the knife for these surgeries, you're going to have this inevitable 7 to 8 players had way worse injuries than we all thought. We saw it out of the Tampa Bay Lightning. The reports are coming out from a day ago where it's Braden Points playing through broken rib cartilage, and Victor Hedman has, they called it like a hip pointer, but it looked way worse than just a hip pointer. So you're going to see this come out of the Avalanche. And while everyone looks at that and goes, oh, there's no excuses in sports, there's not excuses. There are explanations, though.
There's context. I say it all the time. It's not excuses, it's context. Like, you just can't ignore, to your point, the fact that Josh Manson's playing at 50% by the time he goes back out of the lineup. If you told me he was anything over 50%, I'd be shocked. And again, that's not an excuse for his poor play, but it's context.
Yeah. I mean, it's sports, man. I mean, it's, there's, that we had a big discussion earlier in the week about how much of a failure, quote unquote, this season was. And that's just not a word I was willing to use. For the Avs, given the context of the situation. Did they play as well as they wanted to in that series? No, they did not.
No.
But there were also some extenuating circumstances that contributed to that.
I still look at the series and go, you showed up for 2 games, maybe 2.5, you could call it. But game 6 and 7, certainly you were the better hockey team on the ice. You come away with a 4-1 win, and then a crappy bounce is the difference in game 7, and that's just the way it breaks. Like, same thing happened with the Boston Bruins. They failed to put away the Pittsburgh. I do this so many times. I don't know why it's the Pittsburgh Panthers. It's probably my ACC days. Always do. I always do. Nelly.
You were going to go Pittsburgh Panthers. I thought you were just saying Penguins, but Pittsburgh Panthers.
Oh, I'll get into the Penguins. When we talk about the offseason, I will talk about some Pittsburgh Penguins. You bet I will. When I look at what happened to Boston and the Panthers, you failed to put away a team up 3-1 and then decide to go away from a clearly injured Linus Ullmark to put in Jeremy Swayman, which it worked for the Bruins all season long, ham and egging those 2 goalies, but anything can happen in a game 7. They lose 4-3 in overtime. He gets short-sighted 3 separate times in that game. The same thing happens with the Avs. You decide to play hockey, or maybe it just happens that those were the 2 games that you just had everything click and you felt healthy and you felt like your legs were back, but you wait until that late in the series and a bounce goes off of Ben Meyer's hand and you fail to get a whistle on a Jordan Eberle tripping call. You can't wait that long, despite being as injured as the Avs were, or as absent as certain players were, Valeri Nichushkin. You can't be that injured or absent and leave it up to chance in game 7. That's where the failure happened, right? The season as a whole, I can look at the original goals that they set out. Sure, your goal is to defend a Stanley Cup championship. You didn't do it. I guess you could call that a failure, but context changes everything, just as Jesse eloquently put it. In the series, there was a failure. There was a failure to show up and play your game until late in the series, and you gave yourself a chance. It just wasn't enough.
Did they take Seattle too lightly?
Okay, so I don't think you'd never get a guy to admit that. And Jared Bednar, pushed back on that notion a couple times. Yeah. You just won't convince me that they maybe weren't expecting what Seattle brought. At least in game 1, they looked caught off guard to me. And, I had a conversation with someone, and they were saying that after game 1, after the loss, they said, I don't know, there's just like a lot of noise surrounding the situation. And when I kind of pressed them on it, they had a hard time putting it into words, but I really did kind of take it as they pushed and they pushed and they pushed, and they knew it was going to be this long grind coming down the end. And I think when they got to the playoffs, they were just expecting to get that natural boost, because we've seen it in the past, that big adrenaline rush. They come out in game 1, and when it just didn't kind of all come together, I think they were just a little stunned. And I don't know if that's necessarily taking them lightly, but I just don't know if they were fully prepared when the puck dropped on game 1.
They also finished with such a flourish that I wonder if they just felt like we're good. We're good.
Letdown.
And we are joined by Peter Baugh as well. Peter, welcome of The Athletic.
Hey, I'm so sorry I'm late.
Oh, it's fine.
This building is a little confusing. I took a wrong turn, but we made it.
It's all good. You're here.
We're all good.
You're here. What was your view of that Seattle series?
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, the Kraken are a really deep team with a lot of good forwards, and the Avs by the end of the series, by the start of the series, honestly, weren't a very deep team, and by the end, they especially weren't a very deep team. I don't know if maybe they were caught off guard in game one, like Jesse was saying, but I also just think that they might have been tired. And there were some warning signs down the stretch of they were winning games, but their schedule was really easy, and they were going to OT against the Ducks and the Coyotes and the
just
Sharks.
Scratch out those wins.
Exactly. I think they were in their last like 8 games against, or they were like 500 against playoff teams in their last 2 months or something, or maybe not. It might have been like 4-4-2 or something. I don't have the exact record in front of me. So there were definitely some warning signs. And then I think when Nichushkin left the lineup, I think that was probably the last thing that, I mean, they just had no depth scoring whatsoever.
Yeah. Interesting season that the Avs had. When we come back, what we're going to do is dive into the offseason. There's just a lot happening with the roster. We will talk about Nichushkin. We'll talk about Gabe Landeskog, and then just like 1,000 restricted free agents and unrestricted free agents for this hockey club.
5 forwards currently signed on the roster. Like, people who want roster overhaul, there's no way around it. There will be changes.
Yeah, they're about to get it. All right, more with Peter and Jesse when we come back.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the reality of it. I think you're looking at, we've got, these core pieces are guys that we've been building around are all locked up long term. There's a couple restricted free agents that we have their rights to that need to be negotiated with, and then there's a boatload of free agent guys, right? So that it'll be a busy off season. The team will certainly look different next year in many regards, I would think, just by looking at the number of free agents that we have. So that it's going to be. It will likely be a busy off season, and the team's certainly going to look different. But going back to the silver lining piece of it, I think if you take anything out of this season, and with the guys that were out and the guys that were able to continue to play, if you look at that core group of guys and what they did this year, I mean, I felt like they were outstanding.
The team will certainly look different. Those were the words of Avalanche coach Jared Bednar yesterday on the morning show. There's a lot of free agents, and we'll roll through those here in a second. Raj, I'm going to have you explain the salary cap situation.
All right, so what's happening with the cap this year is it's most likely going to go up just $1 million to 83.5, right? We're at 82.5 this season, but there's a small chance, and Gary Bettman came out, I want to say it was in January or February of this year, and came out and said there is a small chance that it could raise as much as $4.5 million to get the number to 87. And the way that happens, again, it is a small sliver of an opportunity for this to happen. The Players Association has $1.5 billion to pay back to the ownership based off of the COVID lost season and the shortened season, right? So everything works on escrow in the NHL. And if there's a windfall of ticket sales, and Peter was saying it off air, if Seattle and Toronto continue these crazy runs, big market teams, big money teams, there is a small chance that $1.5 billion could be paid off by the end of the year. If it does get paid off, the owners and the league will be able to move that salary cap up to 87. For Avs fans, you're wanting a lot for that to happen. Mm-hmm. Chances are it doesn't, but it's still out there.
And if it goes up by $1 million, it looks like the Avs will have around $13 million in cap space, roughly speaking. A couple of the notable free agents here: restricted free agents, Alex Newhook, Bo Byram, Dennis Morgan, and then unrestricted free agents. Easy for me to say: Eric Johnson, JT Comfort, Evan Rodriguez, Andrew Cagliano, Lars Eller, Darren Helm, Jack Johnson, Matt Nieto. So there's just a ton to think about. But where I want to start with you guys is with a guy who we know is coming back, and that at some point maybe, and that would be Gabe Landeskog. What is your expectation of his availability for next season? We'll start with you, Peter.
I mean, I think that's the biggest question for the Avs. Landeskog himself said he's not sure he's going to be ready for the start of next season. He didn't rule out another surgery. That would be a fourth on the same knee. So frankly, there's a lot of uncertainty there, both from the player's perspective, I'd imagine from management perspective. And I think that one of the most important things for the Avs this offseason that they have to do is get some clarity on whether Gabe Landeskog is going to be back at any point next season. I think that it can go one of two ways. If you know he's going to be back, then you have him back, and then you're doing great because you have a top line winger back in the lineup. If you don't know that, if you know that he's not going to be back, then you have $7 million of cap space you can play with. You can put him on LTIR. You can use that to bolster your depth. You can get a little better. What they really need to avoid is kind of what they had this year, which was $7 million that they just weren't using either on Landeskog or on depth because they weren't sure if he would be back. And that's not to point fingers at anyone. I think it was kind of a situation that wasn't really anyone's fault. It just was this injury has lingered longer and longer and longer, and we'll see if that continues. Hopefully for Landeskog's sake, it gets better and he's able to be healthy and play. But if not, they have to have clarity on that pretty soon, because I think that's the biggest question going into the offseason is Gabriel Landeskog going to be available? Can he play? And if not, can they get enough clarity on that to use that cap space in other manners?
Well, and just to build on that a bit with what Peter's talking about, them just kind of not really knowing and just continuing to roll. My understanding of the situation, they weren't really even expecting to be without Gabe Landeskog until like 3 weeks before training camp started. He started getting on the ice for these captain skates and realizing this just like doesn't quite feel right. So they were just like chasing this weird snowball that just kept rolling downhill all season long on Gabe. So like Peter said, get clarity there one way or the other. My expectation for him is I'm almost going in planning that he's not going to play next regular season and do something with that $7 million until you have something that tells you otherwise.
And doing something with that $7 million almost assuredly means 1 year deal, maybe overpay for someone, because if he doesn't play next season, there has to be some hope that your 31-year-old captain is not done for his career, right? Even if it's just like you're going in, you're completely reconstructing something down there in that knee. You have the whole offseason, and then you get to hope and pray that he plays the season after that, or maybe he pops in during the postseason. If you have that $7 million around, is that just used on a 1-year rental, or will you see McFarland and Sackett kind of allocate that to different players?
I think it'll depend on the cap situation beyond this year. Because, yeah, you do have to be conscious of that's the thing, is there's so many moving parts with the salary cap. I think sometimes fans want to just look at the immediate next year, but you also have to think about Devon Taves' contract is up after next season. Mikko Rantanen is eligible for an extension next offseason. Like, you have all these decisions that are going to keep getting harder and harder. Like, and you can't just plan for the immediate future. So I think 1-year deals would make sense if that's the route they go. Maybe some. Yeah, he seems pretty happy in Dallas. And I think but maybe guys who want to chase a cup, some veterans who are available and looking for a good team, and maybe would take a slight discount to play for a team that they think has a chance to win. But yeah, I think you've got to be really careful of, even if you have that extra money, you've got to be really careful of how you spend it, because you have to look beyond this year.
It's a great point too, because you look back at some of the teams, even Boston, despite how it ended for them this year, teams like Boston, Pittsburgh, Tampa, the way that they've had, this sustained success, Chicago in the 2010s, you got to keep your core intact. You got to have your baseline of players. For the Avs, that's McKinnon, Makar, Rantanen, hope Gabe Landeskog. And as long as you keep that intact and you can just build around it, you're always going to be in it. You're always going to be in contention when you have that level of superstar player. To Peter's point, you got to be really careful, because it's about tweaking around the edges and making sure that it all fits around the edges and in that depth. And that was what made last year's team so good, was that their depth just chewed up other teams in the playoffs. You got to keep your core intact, and then it's just about how do you work around the edges. And to Peter's point, you have to be really smart with the dollars and cents to make sure you're tweaking around the edges in the right way.
You're listening to the Avs Roundtable here. That was the voice of Jesse Montano, DNVR. Peter Baugh of The Athletic here, along with Chris and Raj. Guys, what is your what's your best understanding of the Valeri Nichushkin situation?
Well, I think there's only so much you could say right now. Yeah. I mean, it was on The Athletic, the police report, the incident report, obviously not like a criminal investigation, but that's not a good situation. Whatever was going on does not sound like a good situation. The team has been very cagey with information, perhaps at times to their own detriment. And so right now, what we know is what was in the incident report, and that he's away from the team for personal reasons. It was unclear if he was going to be able to come back at any point in the playoffs. It didn't seem like they were super hopeful.
Yeah.
And I think that they really missed him. I think they probably win the Seattle series if he's in the lineup, but obviously there were bigger things going on. It's certainly a concerning situation, and one would think that he would be back and ready for next year, but it's I don't know, the way the team, the caginess with which they were speaking makes it hard to have any understanding, frankly.
And it makes it hard to have any assumptions about, to your point, when he'll be back. Had the Avs kept going, you don't know if they make a run, and had they made another run to the Cup, you're talking about 2 months. It really, to Peter's point, it didn't even sound like there was a ton of clarity on if he'd be back in time for that. It's hard because there's very little information that's out there that's concrete. The little information that is out there has a lot of muddy details around it. Not really sure how a lot of it fits together. yeah, he's away from the team, and I'm kind of trying to, because to Peter's point, we haven't gotten a lot of information. I'm trying to look at what they're, we know it's not disciplinary. It's a personal matter, and that's really kind of the only thing is it's personal to him. So I'm just kind of listening to what's not being said and trying to rule out what it isn't, and then going from there. Not a good situation.
And I'll say this: even they say it's not disciplinary or whatever, but I asked Bednar straight up if it was his decision to step away from the team.
Great question.
And he didn't answer. Like he no commented, and I don't think necessarily that's Bednar's decision to decide. I don't think he's necessarily the one deciding who, if he's commenting or not. I think that comes from higher up. But I think that it's clear that it was the police report that came out was concerning. There's no criminal investigation. And Nichushkin's agent he told me that Nichushkin wasn't involved, despite the fact that the police report names him. So it's a muddy situation. But what you do know is what's in the police report, and that's that a woman was taken from the team hotel to the hospital, and you hope that she's doing okay and whatever. And you hope she's doing okay. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, just from a journalistic standpoint, it's like there's a lot happening, and to you guys' point, just not a lot of connecting of the dots just quite yet. We will see what happens over time.
Yeah, it's muddy to try and step through until we have some clarity. I don't know whether or not I'm looking at this with the lens that I have for Gabe, just in terms of a roster spot, in terms of a player, right? We're talking about next year, what they do in the offseason. Jesse mentioned that you have to have the core locked down. Val Nichushkin at 28 years of age, being one of the best 200-foot wingers in the game, and I wouldn't say diamond in the rough, but a reclamation project for sure, being a number 10 overall pick out of Dallas and then nearly being out of the league. He's part of that core. He's a younger guy. You decide to sign him over a 32-year-old Nazem Kadri. Going back last year, I still think I make that signing as well. He's too damn important to this team on the ice. That's also nearly $6.2 million that's out of the lineup. How do you reconcile that going into the offseason? Do you have to expect that cap hit and that Val is ready to play next year? How do you...
I think you have to... for as little as we're getting publicly, like, they need to get that figured out internally relatively quick. Because, if he's not coming back, you're talking about a completely different kind of windfall of situations where you're talking about contract terminations and him having to leave the league and things like that. And then, on the flip side of that, I guess that technically would reopen all kinds of money, and that just changes your situation. But you're right about him being part of the core. He's signed long-term. So, Peter was mentioning that beyond this year, you've got Taves and Rantanen coming up soon. Val Nichushkin should not be a guy that you're having to worry about that kind of stuff with. You signed him long-term last summer. He got more term than I thought he was going to from the Avs. So, he's part of your core. He's part of that top six that you... up until a couple weeks ago, we're hoping and expecting to have as a major contributor for the foreseeable future. And now with that being drawn into question at all, I'm expecting that he'll be back next season until we have a reason to not expect that. But it's not completely out of the question, I guess, to look at that and say, we need to know what's going on.
We haven't seen a contract termination in the NHL since, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Slava Voinov?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't see it. Frankly,
I would be shocked
a contract terminate, because then it's, even if, and I'm not saying this is the case at all, but even say the Avs wanted to do that, then you're getting into player grievances from the league,
the PA.
It would, and you can't really terminate a contract if there's no criminal charge.
I don't expect them to. And again, I hope he's on the roster next year. I hope that there's not any foul play involved in this situation. Him being on the roster is key to this cup window continuing to be as wide open as it is. You have to have that guy as a top 6, if not top 3 forward on your team.
Well, and that's kind of my point too, Peter, is that if you do get into that, that's why I think I've seen people throwing the contract termination thing around. Oh, I don't know if he'll be back. To Peter's point, that's not an insignificant thing. If that were to play out on either end, whether it be Val trying to terminate or the Avs, it is not an insignificant thing.
It's the nuclear option.
There's a lot that goes into that. So I'm not anticipating that at all. It's a big deal. To your point, it does not happen very often.
All right. A lot to think about in terms of what they need to add to this roster. Second line center, we came into the season with that being a question. And I think we're exiting the season with a similar question there. Is that the most pressing issue on this roster coming into this offseason?
I would say yes. I mean, other than the uncertainties around Landeskog and Nichushkin, I do wonder what JT Compher would have looked like. I think he had a great year. Like I think JT Compher, people give him a lot of heat for what he's not, but I think what he is a very good middle six player. He's going to get Selke votes this year, down ballot votes. He's able to chip in offensively. But you saw in the playoffs in a 7-game series, he had 2 points and none were at even strength. And I think that what I would have been interested to have seen is how he would have looked if he had played a full season or playoff run with Landeskog and Nichushkin on his wings rather than playing on a line with Lars Eller and Evan Rodriguez. So I think that the Avs definitely need a second-line center. I think that the second-line center will have much less responsibility if he's playing with elite-level wings, which in an ideal version for the Avs they would have, but which is hard to say that they'll have with certainty. Because you just don't know what the deal is with all these moving parts. But I think, yes, in short, yes, they need to get some clarity on the second-line center. I thought JT Compher was a perfectly acceptable second-line center in the regular season. I think that the second line in the playoffs was definitely left a lot to be desired and was part of the reason that they weren't able to come away with the series win.
Well, and you were hoping that you would see a step out of Alex Newhook, a more significant step, I guess. You know, coming off his rookie year, last year, I actually thought there was a lot to be encouraged about. I know people didn't love his playoff performance on the run to the Cup, but I looked at it and I said, that's a young player, first-year player. I thought he had a good run. You were hoping for him to take a step, and it just didn't happen. He just never really started to elevate his play. You were hoping that by the end of the year, he'd be looking like a guy who was pushing for that second-line center. Just didn't happen. JT Compher, I'm with you, Peter, like clearly outplayed him. I thought Compher had a great year, but he's a guy that you don't know if he'll be back next year. No doubt that's something that you got to take a look at and you got to get figured out because you do have this elite core. You do have, theoretically, elite wingers playing that second line. You saw it in Washington for years. You need center depth to win. You need center depth.
And Newhook's interesting to me because he still is only 22 years old.
Young kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's probably someone who could really benefit from a long offseason.
Totally.
Like you look at last year, the short offseason, the fact that by the time you're done kind of celebrating with the Cup, they didn't have very much time to get ready. And it's like Newhook, it was kind of, in some ways, it's like, how is he going to be a better player than
How do you take that step?
Yeah, if you didn't really have any time to work on it. And then not to mention that he kind of immediately wasn't playing with Landeskog and Nichushkin on his wings, all that stuff. So I think confidence is a big thing for Newhook. Like, I actually thought the last 2 games of the Seattle series, I thought he played really well.
Game 7 in particular,
Yeah.
solid in Game 7.
Yeah, if he plays like that and simplifies his game a little bit and is not trying to do as much skill-wise and is just relying on his skating and putting the puck on the net because he's got a good shot, like, he can be a good player. And I think that, again, this is a guy who's put up 30-plus points in consecutive seasons as a 21 and 22-year-old. Like, that's not the worst outcome for a number 16.
It's not easy to score 15 goals in the NHL.
Well, and so not to like just pile on this guy for no reason, but I've had a lot of people that say, "Oh, is he going to be like Tyson Jost and kind of fit?" Newhook's rookie year, he had a higher point total than Tyson Jost's career high. So like he's already blown past that in terms of the production side of it. So like you are correct, he's a young kid with still a lot ahead of him. Don't write him off quite yet, but it was definitely disappointing this year.
Totally. And this team needs its young. The way when you're going to have guys like McKinnon making 12.6, Rantanen's making $9 million, McCarr's making $9 million. Like, you need your young, cheap players on entry level or early career contracts to produce. You need cheap production, essentially. And Newhook's next contract isn't going to be super expensive because of the year he had. But they're going to need him to be ready to go and step up next year.
There's some other guys I want to talk about as well. We'll do that on the other side of this break. Welcome back to the program on a, it's a nice weather day.
It is
out here
a
today.
program.
Yeah, it is.
It's nicer out than it looks. I'm wearing a hoodie because all I did was look out the window.
You're
and
wearing a hoodie
I
because
walked
that's
outside.
that is the Jesse Montano
We don't need to get
personality.
into
Let's be
this.
real.
We don't need to get down. We don't need to go down this road. And I thought it was chillier out, and I walked outside, and I got 10 feet out the door. I was like, I'm not going back now, but it is warmer than this hoodie is. Would like it.
Denver bringing it with weather-wise, no doubt. Into the last segment of our Avs Roundtable, we really appreciate the insight and just opinions. Jesse Montano, DMVR, Peter Baugh, The Athletic, Raj,
What up?
Yep, absolutely. So, Raj, you want to continue on the down the road with Alex Newhook?
Yeah, I want to make the point that unless Alex Newhook is part of some trade package in the offseason to bring in a big-time second-line center, unless he is part of a trade that also includes, for me, moving salary out the door because you are in a cap-constrained year, I don't see a world in which he's not brought back under a bridge deal for a cheap dollar amount. Like this, I don't see any chance that Chris McFarland moves on from that player that young. And obviously this year we're diminishing returns, but unless he's moved as part of a player and pick package, he's back on this roster next year and slotted into that third line.
And I also think that you can't move Newhook unless it's for someone who has longer term.
Yeah.
Like you can't move Newhook for a 1-year guy unless it's like Austin Matthews. Which don't aggregate me. I'm not saying I think that I do.
Peter Baugh, Austin Matthews to the Avs.
But you just can't trade Newhook for a 1-year guy because it comes back to you need cheap contracts on this team, given how much the big guys are making. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a 0% chance that he gets traded because maybe they do identify a guy who has a little more term that they can like package him and picks to bring in. But I think I see a lot of people who say trade Newhook while also saying that he stinks. And I'm like, well, you realize that if you're saying that he stinks,
Right.
Somebody else sees that too.
Then you're not going to get that much for him, which I do think Newhook has value. But I think the cognitive dissonance of people saying trade him for something good while also believing he is not good is very funny.
Yeah. You hear it all the time with people talking about Sam Girard, like, oh, he's the worst defenseman in the NHL. They should trade him. It's like, if that's actually how you feel, what do you think he's worth?
Trade him for a 2C.
Right. Yeah. He's terrible. Trade him for a 2C. It's like, what? But no, it's going to be so interesting this summer to see what they do with guys like this and with guys like Byram, because you do have to start making contract decisions. And are they, like, I look at the JT Comfort contract that he's coming off of.
3.5
by 4 years, $3.5 million. I think that's a deal they're going to be trying to dole out to some of these guys in the lower half of the lineup that are young guys. I don't know if Byram would take something like that.
That's going to be a tough negotiation.
That's going to be a
That
tough
seems low for Baugh.
It seems low.
Like you threw out in your article, the $4 million bridge deal that
Dobson
with the Islanders got, and that feels low to me as well.
But I mean, Dobson has had more production than even last year. Like the thing with Baugh is that he was so good in the Stanley Cup run. Like he was just so good. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and it might end up being Byram. The thing is it feels low, but he doesn't have much leverage right now. Unless he gets offer sheeted, like what's he going to do? Just so it feels like it might be destined for a short-term deal that can get him to, which is also kind of dangerous for the Avs to play, because if he breaks out in that contract, then all of a sudden, like, you might not be able to afford him. So do you try and extend him long-term and kind of handcuff yourself in the short term? Or do you try and bridge it and just know that it's going to be really tough when 3 years from now? Like, it's not an easy situation at all for Colorado, and I don't think that is going to be an easy negotiation, because you have a guy who has shown how good he can be, who also has at times been hurt and not played, and that's not his fault. But I think that's something that
it's gonna factor into the negotiation.
Yeah.
If you're the Avs and you're not, and again, as bad as that can feel, that is the reality that Bowen Byram has missed a lot of time in a young career. And that has to come up. Like you're not doing your job if that doesn't come up in a negotiation.
Yeah, and that's like Dobson put up I think before his last deal, I think he had put up like 51 points in a season, which is a lot for a defenseman. And he had been on teams that were pretty good on the Islanders. So it's really tough, and I don't think that will be an easy negotiation, and I think that potentially it could take a while to resolve.
Do you think Newhook gets done pretty quick?
To me, Newhook feels like a pretty clear bridge deal.
Yeah.
Because I think for him, it's like, yeah, I want to show more and make more money than what you would give me long term. And I think for the Avs, they probably want to see more before they give him a long term deal. Whereas Byram, I think there is the consideration of like, this guy could be part of our core.
Can we? What kind of deal can we get this dude on for 7 years? Kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, they did that with Gerard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they signed a younger defenseman to a longer term deal so that they could have him and have that cost certainty.
How would you feel about the Gerard deal for Byram this summer?
Would he do it? That's my question.
Oh, I would do it in a heartbeat.
Because what is it, 5.5?
If I'm general management and I do it, if
if
I can get him on that deal, I do it in a heartbeat.
I agree.
If I'm Byram, I probably pump the brakes on it.
Because that's probably more than he's worth right now today. But
when he's on the ice, that is a great deal.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. We know Byram a little bit, and this is a guy that, and I mean this in a complimentary way. I'm not saying this in a negative way at all. This is a guy who knows how good he is.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's gonna like look at a contract like that and think, oh wow, that's a lot of money, maybe more than I'm worth. Like I should take that. I think he's gonna say, no, I'm a really good player. And
confident young man.
Yeah, he knows that he's really good. And he is really good. And so I think, I think a Gerard type deal is one that the Avs would do, or at least I think that they should do. But I don't know if that's a for sure that Byram would take that.
Given how this team finished the season and some of the inconsistencies within the season, how much should the roster turn over? I mean, how many these guys should be brought back?
Look, I really do kind of subscribe to what I was talking about earlier. You got to keep your core together, and then other than that, you can make it work. You can find stuff around the edges. I'd like to see a guy like JT Compher back. I think you said this earlier. I think he's a guy that's major underappreciated. I think for what he does bring to the middle six. I think people maybe have bloated expectations for him because he's had this, spot duty at times in the top six over the last couple of years. That's a guy that I think is kind of like an Andre Palat type for the Lightning, where just fills a really important role in the bottom half of your lineup, has a weird track record of scoring like hugely clutch goals in the playoffs. That's a guy I'd like to see them bring back. But otherwise, as much as I like a lot of those guys around the fringes and the way that they fit into this room, as long as you can keep your core intact, fill out your roster with the players that you think help you or give you the best chance on any given night.
And I think with Compher, what's interesting with him is that this is going to be his biggest chance in his career to make money. Yeah. Like this is the best season he's had. He's still on the right side of 30.
It's a weak UFA class.
So I think it's going to be very difficult to pay JT Compher what he'll want. Like I think if you're the Avs, you try and make an offer that is maybe fair, but probably on the lower end, and you say, look, we know you can probably get more than this on the open market. This is the best we can do. Like,
try to sell him on the situation.
Yeah, and if you're Compher, you probably say, look, I appreciate it, but I'm gonna go get paid. I've already won a cup. He's. So I think that's what's gonna make this difficult, is that there's gonna be teams willing to pay him more than the Avs have room to pay him. I mean, you look at like what Andrew Kopp got last year, and his numbers weren't drastically different than Compher's, and that was a much stronger free agent class than this one.
Yeah.
As we look at this weak free agent class, is there anyone that you guys have your eyes on, or is it all kind of trade market? Again, like it's not a banger UFA class right now. You're going to have to overpay for centers. You're going to have to overpay for defensemen. Are they going to dive into the free agency class? If so, who do you like? If not, are there any ethereal trade partners out there?
I mean, my guess is this is a kind of tight-lipped front office, but what you can do is you can look at what they've done in the past, which is not overpay for free agents. Like that is something that this front office has really avoided doing. And I think that especially outside of the organization, I think they've made exceptions. I think Landeskog, they didn't want to pay him as much as they paid him. Clearly those negotiations went right down to the wire, but they decided that was worth it because he was a guy they knew. I don't envision them overpaying for a guy that's out on the market that's not one of their own. So I think that the moves on the market are maybe the ones more around the edges to kind of shore up your team. Maybe you try and pitch like James Van Riemsdyk on a cheap deal and come chase a cup here, all that stuff, maybe you do that. And then I think if for the 2C, if you're going to try and get a second line center, I don't think that there's a free agent one out there. I think that's one you're going to have to look at the trade market for, whether that's someone like Nick Schmaltz, whether it's Kevin Hayes in Philly. Like there's not a ton of like seamless fits. And the other thing maybe they try and do is try and find someone younger who they think can flourish in their system. I mean, I think you've seen them do that with goaltenders really, really successfully, both with Grubauer and with Georgiev. And maybe they try and do something similar with forwards.
Last summer, Kirby Dach was a guy that I wondered if they would maybe have tried what you're talking about there at center, and obviously it didn't go that way. I'm going to be keeping an eye on them. They held on to their first round pick at the deadline. I'm going to be curious to see if they do anything with that at the draft. See if they, they've been more than happy to part ways with high end, top of the draft picks these last couple of years. I'm going to see if they're interested in doing that. Schmaltz is honestly a guy that's on my radar from Arizona. Arizona's collecting as many, draft picks and scratch lottery tickets as they can get right now. Schmaltz is a guy that's on my radar. And then the only guy, and we'll see if he even makes it to UFA, the only guy to me on the UFA list that does jump out, I don't know what he would cost because he does not give home, discounts to anybody, is Ryan O'Reilly. I frankly don't think the Avs would have the money to afford him unless you've got that $7 million from Gabe Landeskog all of next year. Outside of that, I think I'm mostly with you guys where I look at the trade market, the free agent market just doesn't really move the needle a ton for me.
Pretty much, if I may ask you gentlemen a question, pretty much the second the clocks hit 000s in Game 7, we've had people texting us and people chatting at us on Twitch, go get Sidney Crosby, go get Sidney Crosby, go get Sidney Crosby, go get Sidney Crosby. Yeah. What do you guys think about the possibility of that actually happening?
I think it's close to 0%.
So like 3-4 years ago, I made the joke to a buddy. I was like, I wonder if when Sidney Crosby gets to the end of his run in Pittsburgh, he'll want to come, run 1 year with his Cole Harbor buddy in Colorado. And I said it totally as a joke. And that seems to be like a lot of people think that's what's going to happen now. This offseason, I would probably put it at 0.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think Crosby, he really vouched for Letang and Malkin to get extensions in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And I don't think he would feel good about like forcing his way out and demanding a trade and hanging his buddies out to dry or something,
right.
After vouching for them to stay and all that. So it just feels out of character. Like Crosby's not getting traded unless Crosby wants to get traded. Yeah. And I don't think he, at this point, would want that. 2, Crosby strikes me as a guy who I don't know this for sure. I've only talked to him a few times, but like I feel like guys like that often value the one team the whole career, like playing on one team and it's not like he needs a cup.
He'll get to play with Nate in the next Olympics run. Like, he'll be fine. He'll get that.
Yeah.
Well, and then my other thing too is Pittsburgh missed the playoffs this year, but like I don't necessarily think that team's like done competing.
No.
Their goaltending completely fell apart at the end of the year,
and they need to make some big. Their trade deadline was abysmal, and it makes sense that they moved on from their their old GM. So I think that I can't imagine a new GM coming in and say, "Oh, you know what I'm going to do to endear myself to this fan base?
Trade like a top 3 player of all time."
I mean, that's what happened in Chicago, though. The new GM came in. He was like, "I don't have time for legacies. Patrick Kane gone. Jonathan Taves gone. DeBrincat gone."
And Pittsburgh's former GM signed everybody, right? They signed everybody, and then he got canned.
Yeah.
But he also, I don't think the signing Malkin and Letang and Crosby is what got him canned. It was the fact that they didn't do anything to put good players around them.
So, this is a total tangent. We can take 15 seconds on this, but you mentioned Crosby having the legacy. Here's a question I've asked a couple guys, and I asked a couple Avs players in the locker room. Whose career would you rather have? Crosby or LeBron? Take the money out of it, because if you count the money, it's LeBron easily.
$431 million
Right.
over his career.
Take the money out of it career-wise. Like LeBron, he's got the championships, but it's with 3 different teams. He's got Olympics. Crosby's got all that stuff. It's with the Penguins, and then it's Olympic gold medals. Who would you rather have?
LeBron, because I think that with Crosby, he's very clearly like a top 5 or 6 player of all time, but he's not Gretzky or Lemieux. LeBron, like, you can make the case is the greatest player of all time. And he's got like the storybook, like coming back to Cleveland to win a title. Like
After he left and won too.
I know, but it's still like I love LeBron and I love Crosby. I would gladly trade careers with either of them.
Crosby, LeBron?
Boy, I like the story of I like one franchise players. I like what and Crosby has look, top 5 player of all time. For one franchise, I'll take that. I'll take that.
The other thing that Sid has over LeBron is he has the greatest sports moment in the history of his country.
Okay,
The golden goal in 2010 is arguably the greatest moment in Canadian sports history.
Yeah. You could also argue though that like LeBron's block on Iguodala,
Right.
That was huge.
is
Yeah,
like one
that
of
was
the
huge.
It's iconic,
greatest
yeah.
basketball moments in the history.
history of the league.
Sid comes
Yes.
without a little bit of controversy. Although, like, he was hated because he was a little bit of a crybaby early on in his career.
Yeah.
But he comes without the off-court, off-ice controversy that LeBron does.
But LeBron, what is his real off-court controversy? That he went to Miami and
just the
raised
decision.
money
That's about it.
for TV.
Yeah.
Like
People
for,
don't like Taco Tuesday.
exactly.
for someone,
Yes.
for someone as
Space
big-
Jam 2 was nonsense.
Yeah, for someone as
that was a
big,
bad movie.
It was not great. But for someone as big as LeBron, to have like his controversies are pretty small.
Yeah.
He's a little cringe
He's just
on
annoying.
social media.
He's just annoying, yeah.
Yeah, but he opened a school for
Yeah.
kids and
He did.
he's objectively a pretty good person. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, the second Space Jam movie.
Yeah.
Guys, we really appreciate your time here today. Avs wrap up their season. They have a big off season. We will be following all of the stuff that these guys are doing. Let's just really quickly, how do we find you social media?
Twitter at Jesse Montano, MONTANO _. There's another Jesse Montano out there, so I got the underscore at the end. Or the DNVR.com. All of our stuff's there.
Peter?
I'm at theathletic.com and at Twitter it's Peter _Baugh, BAUGH.
There they go. All the Avs knowledge that we need to know going into the offseason, fellas. We really appreciate your time here. We'll have you back.